All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is the first of hopefully many interviews I'll be doing on my YouTube channel. I'm sure many of you will recognize Francis and Constantine. They are from Triggernometry. It's a wonderful podcast and YouTube show. It's all about honest conversations with fascinating people, but I'll let them introduce themselves. For anyone who doesn't know you guys, give us the rundown. Who are you and what do you do?
Right, so who we are two comedians from the UK who started a podcast in April 2018 because we felt we were being, let's put it bluntly, gaslit by what was happening in the UK and with the UK media, the way they were reporting on political events and cultural events. And what we wanted to do was to get to the bottom of these issues and explore them in a more thorough, rigorous, and more importantly, honest way. And we've been on that journey. We've been widely supported by the comedy community. They've really enjoyed our work and what we've done. Very supportive, loved every second of it. And it's been a joy to have all that love and support from our peers.
Absolutely. We've been kicked out of several studios. This is the latest one, so I must apologise. This is our temporary set. This is not the way the set looks. So I apologise for the toxic whiteness of the set.
Yeah.
But that is...
I'm already triggered. This doesn't feel safe to me. So.
Exactly. No, but look, we joke about it. The point of Trigonometry was always to discuss difficult and controversial issues with people who had strong opinions about them in an honest way. And we felt that wasn't happening in the mainstream. It largely wasn't happening outside of the mainstream either. And when Francis talks about being gaslit, particularly as comedians, and I don't know if you can speak to this, but the industry is so, whatever language you want to use, progressive, woke, intolerant, authoritarian at times, we really felt like we were two people with very sensible opinions who were being treated as these pariahs in that industry. And so Trigonometry in many ways was our lifeboat out of that world into something else. And it's as you say, it's on YouTube, it's on the podcast, it's done very well. We've had the Jordan Petersons of the world and other really interesting people on the show to talk about all sorts of things. We're really enjoying it. And thanks for having us.
No worries. Thanks for doing it. I'm a big fan myself. So there's at least one comedian globally that likes what you're doing. Did you feel excluded before you started the podcast, or was it a phenomenon that occurred after you started doing Trigonometry? Is that when you started to feel the ire of your comedy peers?
Well, the ire we started to feel once we started it, but I do think we both felt increasingly disconnected from the world that we're operating in as it moved further and further into craziness. And, I don't really like the terms left and right because I don't think they particularly work for what we're talking about. But as I was starting to feel the comedy people were doing was stifled, the well-intentioned idea that we should increase different groups of people being represented on television, comedy and whatever, it had gone too far to the other side now, where people were no longer being promoted based on merit. It was purely about ticking boxes and all that sort of stuff. As you probably know, speaking out against any of that in comedy in 2017, 2018 was not going to end well for you. So we were starting to feel pretty excluded. But initially, I think we just felt like we had this dark secret that we didn't think like the other people in the industry. And it was starting to grind us down, frankly, I think. It
was starting to grind us down. The other thing that I noticed as well, and this is perhaps even more interesting, is audiences were changing. So I did my first open mic on August the 1st, 2009. Everyone remembers their first time, particularly comedy. And
because you always die.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly, mate. And back then it was very much, everybody wanted to be Frankie Boyle because at the time Frankie was still on Mock the Week and was doing these very edgy jokes, actually, which I'll be honest, isn't my sense of humour really. But everybody wanted to be that. Everybody wanted to emulate that. And if you didn't, you wanted to be Stuart Lee. But there were a lot of people who wanted to be Frankie Boyle, Jim Jeffries, that type of raw, near-the-knuckle comedy. Profane, etc., etc. And gradually, over the years, I just saw what became acceptable to talk about on a comedy stage. The Overton window narrowed and narrowed and narrowed to the result where you would turn up at some gigs which are very metropolitan, very liberal, dare I say woke, and you would use a word like Brexit in the setup, boom, they shut down. They shut down.
Right.
Or you do a joke and they go, ooh, and you're like, guys, that's not an ooh. That's my mum, a first-generation immigrant, voting Brexit.
It's
And
strange,
it was very, very... Sorry?
Yeah. Oh, well, I was just going to say that the same phenomenon occurred in Australia. You know, I started slightly after you guys. I did my first proper open mic gig back in 2012. And that was when it really seemed to be popping off. I remember people who didn't even have jokes. They just said opinions. And they were getting rapturous applause from the audience. And I thought, this isn't comedy, right? This is fine if this is what you want to do. But I don't see what's funny about that.
I didn't realize you started at the same time as Hannah Gadsby, mate.
Yeah, very different career paths there.
But we have seen that, and that type of attitude is not only been in certain clubs, and let's be fair, right? The majority of comedy clubs, I can really only speak for the UK, are not like that. You go to a town outside of London or a city outside of London, and you do that kind of stuff, people look at you and go, mate, what are you doing? We're here for comedy and jokes.
Yeah.
But there is a very small subset of gigs in London where that is the case. And the problem is with that, not that they exist, but the people who run them and the people who like that comedy have a disproportionate sense of power. They are very, very powerful within the industry. For instance, you get a program like The Mash Report, which is very left-wing, but you would never, ever get a topical political show which is as right-wing as The Mash Report is left-wing. It just wouldn't happen. So that's what's happening, is that these people tend to have the power, the dominance within the industry to platform comedians, some of whom are very good, but are very, very left-wing. But it's highly unlikely you will get somebody from the opposite end of the spectrum. And that's a problem.
And Francis mentions The Mash Report. I don't know how familiar you guys would be over in Australia with it, but it was like the Daily Show of the UK, and it was the only one. There wasn't others. It was huge. And I wrote on it, and it got so bad at one point that I would only watch the bit that I helped to work on because the rest of it was just so bad. Do you know what I mean? And that's not how it should be. And the reason is, as I say, I think a lot of it was done on an ideological basis. As you were saying, with people just spouting opinions, it got to a point where it was largely about getting a political message across instead of just making people laugh. And it's very frustrating. And we've seen it with mainstream comedy in this country. Shows like Live at the Apollo, Mock the Week, the Mash Report wasn't even renewed, but the others, their numbers are plummeting because they're not picking the best comedians. They're just not.
It's definitely very similar here in Australia. Ironically enough, I felt like when I did a few of the gigs in London, this would have been in 2015 and 16, I got the sense that, well, one, the comedians were just a lot funnier. They were very sharp, they were very witty. And I remember doing one club in particular, Top Secret Comedy Club, and I just loved the atmosphere there. I loved the way the room operated. All the comedians were really funny. I think comedy being full of artists and people who are generally attracted to the arts, would you say that it will always lean... I know you said you don't like the term left and right, nor do I, but I think just for simplicity, we'll use that here. Do you think the arts and comedy in particular will always lean left, or do you think there has actually been a concerted effort to almost purge any, not even right-wing opinions, but just opinions that aren't, straight out of some kind of, new arts degree or something like that?
They're just a libertarian or liberal in the traditional sense. There's no contradiction between those two options that you've given us there, Neil. So it's possible that, and it is true, that comedy and other art forms will always lean in that direction because they attract a certain people with a certain mindset. But at the same time, it's also true that divergence of opinion has become very, very difficult for people to accept. And that authoritarianism has creeped in as that portion of what we might call the left has become more authoritarian. That has also become part of comedy where, I remember towards the end of my comedy career, people would see me express an opinion online, which wasn't, offensive or evil in any way. They would just see that and they'd email me saying, your booking with our comedy club is cancelled because
really?
we don't think people of your kind should be welcome here.
Well, you're talking about Jews, mate.
Of your kind.
Yeah.
Is that the actual language they used?
Yeah, that's the language they used. To me, I consider myself someone who's in many ways liberal and progressive. To me, that's not being progressive. To me, that's not being open-minded. To me, that's not being liberal. That is being authoritarian. You're saying, I have these opinions and you must have the same. Otherwise, you are unclean, and you must be purged from this environment. And that's what I resisted and rebelled against. I think in comedy, in creative arts of any kind, you need open-mindedness. You need diversity of thought and of perspective. And that was being deliberately suppressed, I felt. And that's why we did, and it's still happening. It's still happening. So that I think is the genesis of the show and where it started, because we felt that things that ought to be able to be said are not being said and are not being allowed to be said. And
look, I get messages from comedians all the time saying, I really like your show. However, I would never retweet. I would never tell anybody that I watched it, because that would mean I could get cancelled. And we get messages from, we get messages from all over the world. I get messages from comedians saying that exact same thing. And when you have that type of atmosphere in an industry, it's crippling. It's crippling.
Climate of fear. And there are some huge comedians, like international names, people who have huge TV careers that watch the show and love the show and come to our live shows even.
Yeah.
And they would never say that they watch and like Trigonometry in public, because even they are afraid. They're multimillionaires, and even they are afraid.
It's really sad. Well, first thing I want to pick up on there is, Constantine, you said that you actually... So are you no longer doing comedy? Because you said, as you were doing comedy there at the end, this sort of phenomenon was happening.
Yeah.
Are you still doing stand-up, or is it...
Not at the moment. So I'm on a bit of a break. I took the last few months to write my book, but also Trigonometry has become not just a full-time job, but like a team of like 7 people that work on the show now, which requires a lot of effort and management and time. So that plus the book for me. And plus, during lockdown, I realized that the comedy lifestyle, and I imagine it's even worse in Australia because of the distances that you have to do to drive to places or to get to places. It was just not working for me. I can't do the lifestyle anymore, So eventually I may well end up coming back and doing my own show to my own audience, and maybe just hitting a few of the big cities. But for the moment, I'm taking a break and really enjoying it, if I'm honest as well. But it doesn't mean I'm not writing comedy in terms of what we do in Trigonometry. There's plenty of comedy that we do. We do our Raw shows, which is just me and Francis joking about the events of the day and stuff. So the comedic instinct, the writing instinct, that's still getting fed. It's just not through the medium of stand-up specifically.
And also as well, the brilliant thing about Trigonometry is we're not beholden to anyone, apart from our tech overlords YouTube, who can end our career in an instant. But apart from them, Neel, we don't have to, we don't have to deal with people or bow and scrape the knee to people who fundamentally disagree with us, which is fine to do. But when you start to restrict people's careers simply because you disagree with their politics, which is often happening to people in our industry, that's when it starts to get really worrying. And it's not just for people like us, because look, we've done all right out of it. The problem is what it does to the art form and what you see on TV. Now, I'm afraid that the quality of the content, when you compare it, let's look at a program like Live at the Apollo. The quality of the content, the quality of the comedy being produced now is vastly inferior to the days of when you had people like Mickey Flanagan on, you had Michael McIntyre, you had Kevin Bridges, etc., etc., etc. And what happens, and I've seen it so often when they have these types of comedians on who, quite frankly, are not good enough to be on this huge mainstream platform. My mates who are really into comedy, who are passionate about comedy, they'll watch it and go, oh, is that what comedy is? And as a result, they're turned off comedy because they think that's what comedy is and that is the cream of the crop. And we all know from gigging on the circuit that that's not true. It's just some people, there's a comedian in the UK called Jeff Innocent, who's an old working class white dude in his early 60s, crushes literally every single gig. Doesn't matter who the audience is, whether from up north, whether down south, ethnicity, age, he absolutely destroys because he's a brilliant comedian and his material is universal, but it's also incredibly personal. But Jeff will never get on TV simply because he's an old white dude and people are like, oh, it doesn't matter, he's past it. It's just desperately sad because he's a maestro.
So they're no longer looking at quality, they're looking at identity ahead of quality. When in theory, what should be happening is, regardless of your identity, we're going to pick the best comedians. We're going to have the ones here who kill it the hardest at the clubs and can perform to thousands of people well. Do you think things are actually changing? Because sometimes I wonder if this sort of peaked in 2017, 18, 19, and now seeing shows like yours pop off on YouTube, and you know, a lot of the younger comedians here in Australia are turning against the mainstream industry, if you want to call it that, and seeing that there may not be a route for them, and they're starting YouTube channels. They're doing a lot more podcasting. They're doing some of my live shows. I've been doing these live shows a bit outside of the industry. Do you think the tide is turning, or do you think people are just doing that sort of thing out of necessity?
We keep arguing about this like an all-married couple, so you go and give them your depressing view of reality, Francis.
I think it's not depressing, it's accurate. Right, for me, Neil, this is what I think. I think it's a case of necessity. The reality is we all dream of having our own TV show, whatever it may be, whether it's a sitcom, topical comedy, etc., where you just focus on being the artist, where you write the script, where you make the script the best possible script it can be. You work on your delivery to make it as pitch perfect. But the problem is, you know that even if you get through those doors, you're going to be censored, you're going to have people, messing with what you do. Oh, this is too far, you can't say this, you can't do that. That actually, the only way to be truly artistic is to forge your own path. You can't do it on the mainstream media. They will want to, influence it. They will want to change it. They will want to do a variety of different things until what you want to create is completely unrecognizable. That's why the most interesting content, the people who we all look up to, are big on YouTube, because they can be their most raw and authentic selves.
I think that's true. I also think, though, that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and the pendulum swings, right? Which is, I think, what you were talking about, Neil. And we have a budding counterculture here in the UK in terms of comedy. There's a comedy club called Comedy Unleashed, which is started by our friend Andrew Doyle, the creator of Titania McGrath, the Twitter personality. Yeah, you'll be familiar with. And that's really about encouraging. It's not about encouraging a particular type of comedy. It's just creating a space where comedians don't self-censor and they do the jokes that they think are funny, and the audience decide whether they're funny or not, which is kind of how it used to be, right? And in terms of stuff that we create, for example, when we started the show, the idea that a show like Trigonometry would have mainstream representation from a large comedy agent was completely unheard of. Now, that's what's happened, right? And that's because the numbers talk. And as I said, the numbers of mainstream stuff are plummeting. If the numbers for alternative stuff are going up, eventually people are just going to have to start to wake up and smell the coffee. And, people are talking to us about doing a satirical TV show. Whether anything comes of that, whether the world is ready for that, we don't know. But I see small signs of progress. And the difference between Francis and I is I'm naturally optimistic, he's naturally pessimistic. So it's probably our biases rather than any sort of connection to reality that's speaking out. But I'm very much with you. I think the counterculture is coming. When that happens, it remains to be seen.
Can I just point out that when it comes to us discussing about what's going to happen over the past couple of years with the pandemic, he's been very optimistic and I've been correct.
He calls himself Fosterdamus now.
Yeah.
It's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
Okay, nice. Bit of harsh reality there. One question I've been thinking about this more recently, maybe in the last year or two, which is, do you think a new stifling culture may be popping up in certain segments of, again, I know we don't like to use these terms, but the right, wherein anything offensive that is said is now automatically, if you say, oh, I didn't find that funny, oh, you're woke. And like there's certain comedians here as well and jokes I've heard where I thought, I just didn't think that was funny. It was definitely a dark joke, but I didn't particularly like the construction of it or something like that. And then you're immediately accused, oh, you're woke, and it's like, no, fuck, no one's. I'm definitely not woke here. Do you think there's a danger of the pendulum swinging too far the other way?
I look, there is always that danger, let's be fair. And there's people on both sides of, let's just call it the argument, who are authoritarian by nature and want to shut down dissent and want to shut down freedom of speech and don't want to debate ideas. It really, really annoys me when I see people on the right trying to cancel people on the left for their opinions. And I'm like, have you learned nothing, you moron, from what we've been talking about and everything that has happened? So I think you do have a point. Unfortunately, if you were going to espouse the values of free speech, then you need to walk the walk. And that means that if somebody says something that you disagree with, you don't automatically try and shut them down. You don't use a term that is trying to smear them. You engage with the argument and you have a discussion. And then at the end of it, if you're both still in your same positions, then you do what adults used to do and say, well, let's agree to disagree.
And I would say as well, the problem with what's happened over recent years is just the entire culture of discussion and joke. Everyone has become hypersensitive, and now you see people on the right, as you say, doing exactly the same thing in some cases. And it's worrying because, I don't know about you, I think you're a little bit younger than us, but I grew up watching people like Bill Hicks and George Carlin. And if you remember, these guys, they made fun of Christianity and religion a lot. And that's because the censors that you can't say that, you shouldn't do this. The people who were like that in their time were the evangelical Christians, the Christian right in America, who they were pushing against. They were the people that were introducing the dogmas of that time, right? So the danger of authoritarianism or censoriousness exists on. That's why I don't like terms left and right, because I always say right now trigonometry is pushing back against some of the excesses of the far left. You could argue. 10 years from now, we're probably going to be pushing back against the right, and we're going to be holding that middle point. It's interesting. Francis was telling me the story how he was chatting. Some guy came up to him, just a fan of ours, and he said, "Look, I've been living during lockdown with my two flatmates. I am right of centre. They are left of centre. And what's happened as I've been watching trigonometry over the last year is I've become closer to the centre from the right, and they've become closer to the centre from the left, right? And that's what we want to do, and that's the angle we're coming from. We are not on the right at all, and we're definitely not on the far left at all. We just want people to start having sensible discussions. And when it comes to humor, your point, just for everybody to understand that jokes are jokes. They're not meant to be taken seriously. To remember irony, to remember sarcasm. But this is a problem with the current political moment: is if everything is so polarized, if everything is so heated, it becomes difficult for people to take a joke. Because, and particularly if you are maybe right of center historically, you feel like you've been the target of jokes for a long time, and you stop feeling like it's all good-natured because the jokes are always about you. Have I got news for you? Another TV comedy show that we've had in this country. I used to love that program, but increasingly people feel like some of the jokes are really just about mocking them, and there's no balance in it. And when there's no balance, it doesn't feel like jokes. It now feels like you're being attacked. And I think that lack of balance is where a lot of the current conversation comes from.
Yeah, and that is the problem, is that nobody minds a joke being aimed at them, but it's when it feels disproportionate that they're constantly aimed at one particular type of person and it's deemed fine. But if you aim the joke at people of left or the woke, and you know it's not going to be platformed, it's not going to be well received, or they simply aren't being heard, that's when people feel that, quite rightly, that the content they're being presented with is utterly biased. They're going to disengage and they're not going to like it.
Yeah, there seems to be an orthodoxy within the comedy community about punching up. And this is a phrase I hadn't even heard of until a couple of years ago. And if I can explain it as best as I can, what they perceive to be a harmful joke, and some would even say equates to violence, is if you are part of a group that has been historically privileged in a collective sense, don't care about individuals here, but if you are a white man or just white or straight, you then can't make jokes, or I mean, if you do make jokes about a group that has historically been marginalized or may not have the same collective economic power as your group, that is then in the really extreme left circles, that's an act of violence. And that's just crazy. I mean, who came up with that? It's also very patronizing and demeaning for someone like me who is a minority to suggest that I can't handle a joke about my race, that I can't handle an Indian joke or I can't handle a brown joke. And look, I think a lot of people are well-intentioned there, trying to protect people who have always been the butt of jokes, and there's certain stereotypes that I definitely roll my eyes out and cringe, but I would never try to censor them. And this is a theory, yet it's been taken as, well, fact, essentially. And in the comedy community, definitely in certain circles of the comedy community in Australia, it sounds like it's the same in the UK, this is what they live by. And there's also no objective measure of just comedy quality. It's essentially, if you are part of a certain group, I can't ever understand what is good comedy from the perspective of, a female or a black female or something like that, because they have a certain perspective that I can never comprehend. So who am I to judge what is good comedy? And there's such clear, obvious markers of what is good comedy, right? The first being, how many laughs did this person bloody get, okay? Now, if you're going to completely throw that out the window, then it does become extremely ideological. I'd be interested to hear what you guys think. If you were to be judging comedy, or if you were to have an opinion of what makes a good comedian, what makes a good joke, what are your ideas about that?
Well, it's a very, actually, on the surface, a very easy question to answer is what makes a good comedian? You go, well, somebody who's funny, obviously. But what is funny to one person, what is funny to another is completely different. I think the more I do comedy, the more I realise that the best comedians are utterly authentic to themselves, and they are who they are as complete as they can be when they go onto the stage. Because obviously a persona is a fabrication. It's, it's an artificial construct where you take elements of personality, you heighten some, you lessen others, and therefore you make it the funniest it can be. But ultimately, the personality has to be a representation of yourself, and it's got to have integrity. Michael McIntyre, I've never met Michael, but a lot of people I know who have gigged with him say that Michael McIntyre, the person who you see on stage, is exactly the same as the person you see off stage. The people who are best are the ones that are utterly authentic. And it doesn't matter what style of comedy they do, whether they do observation, whether they do surreal, whether they do political. That is a representation of who they are, what they think, and what they believe. And they're always the best comedians, in my opinion, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, style, etc.
And I might come across as sounding quite woke now, but I actually do agree with this idea that comedy is very subjective. And so there are comedians who will play to their audience that I personally don't find funny. And I'm not just talking about, a Hannah Gadsby, just as an easy example. There's comedians whose political views and sort of views of the world, more importantly, I probably agree with completely, but I don't find them particularly funny. And they're hugely successful. And there are millions of people around the world that do find them funny. So I think, particularly when you start playing to your own audience, when you go from playing the clubs where it's just a random group of people there who've come to see a comedy night, although, of course, they're not random. As you move out of that world, you realize that the people who go and see a comedy show are a very particular subset of the population. Versus people who will go and see your comedy, which is, again, a particular subset of the population. So when you start playing to your own audience, you realize that what is funny to some people is not funny to others. And the real objective, in my opinion, for a comedian is to find their audience and to lean in. There are some people who are great, they're going to hit everybody, but they're one in a billion, I would say. But for most comedians, the trick is to really lean into who you are. As Francis says, be 100% authentic, do the jokes that you believe, and perform to that audience. So I do get that, but I also think that when you're talking about TV or stuff like that, live at the Apollo, whatever, you do have to have a skill set which is making a large number of people with different views and different experiences laugh, because it has to be generic enough that they can get it, or it has to be delivered well enough that they can get it, even if they're not necessarily familiar with your experience. So I think comedy is very subjective.
It is very subjective, but also as well, and we can appreciate that as three comedians. There's comedy that you listen to and you go, look, it's not for me, but that's a beautiful joke. And that is superbly constructed. And I love what they've done with that. Now, for instance, I'm not a huge fan of surreal comedy. It's not really my thing. But there are people, let's take for an example, The League of Gentlemen. It's not really my thing, The League of Gentlemen. But I can watch a League of Gentlemen episode and go, those are beautifully constructed jokes. What they do, and the world they've created, and how they've set this up, and the characters that live within it, it's wonderful, it's beautiful, it's a comedic masterpiece. Now, it just doesn't, it's not particularly appealing to my palate, but I can still appreciate the craft behind it.
Yeah, I think if you can articulate well-known truths in a funny way, I think that's a really nice summation of what I think good comedy is. I think if you can, number one, be funny, obviously, but number two, provide a perspective that people wouldn't get from anywhere else. And I think Bill Burr is the master of this. He says something that immediately you think, this is insane, where's this guy going? And then through his beautiful construction of a bit, he then actually gets you on side by the end of it. And he's justified the point that he's made. And I think that's just masterful comedy. Whereas I completely agree with you guys that a lot of the people being applauded a lot today, they're saying opinions that you could get from a BuzzFeed article or a Guardian article. And it's like, well, you haven't told me anything interesting here. You've kind of made me laugh a little bit, but not that much. And if I can sort of get the same perspective that you're preaching from a mainstream news outlet, I don't think what you're saying is particularly interesting. So that's the way I'd judge comedy. I'd be very interested to hear what the sort of, how the UK comedy scene has maybe changed over the last 5, 6, 7 years with, well, more recently the lockdowns, but also with the internet and the boom of digital social media comedians, because what it's done here in Australia is it's really decreased the power of the gatekeepers. So there were people who really, they ran the comedy scene essentially. There were a handful of managers. The Melbourne Comedy Festival is a lot like the Edinburgh Fringe in the UK. You went there to be discovered. If you got a few good reviews, then the comedy community would take notice and media personnel would come and see your show. And before you knew it, you were on TV or you were on radio. Whereas now, first of all, there's hardly any comedy left on Australian TV. I think there's one show. And second of all, well, not a lot of people watch the galas, the Melbourne Comedy Festival Gala, which is our equivalent of, say, Live at the Apollo. If you did a good spot there 10 years ago, I remember when I was a kid, so in the early 2000s, if someone did a good spot, they were famous overnight. They would sell out all across Australia. There's a UK comedian, Stephen K. Amos, actually, who I think is bigger here than over in the UK because he did a few good gala spots and he's a very funny man. Now, no one watches it. So there are people on the internet that are just hopping off and selling out theatres across the country, and they've never even been in a comedy club. So I think it's good that it's democratised the art form and you don't need to appease the gatekeepers anymore. But at the same time, there are people with no club experience who are selling theatres. And I can also understand where veteran comedians would be quite frustrated at something like that. Has the UK comedy scene seen a similar change? I know also, I'd also like to touch on the fact that BBC is actually, that's a government broadcaster, right? Because we have ABC here, which is a government broadcaster, which is another element. I mean, how edgy can you be if your career is funded by the taxpayer, right? I mean, I find that just very confusing. So, what
well, it kind of
changes
depends
have
on
you
whether the tax. It sort of depends on whether the taxpayer's got balls. Do you know what I mean? Like, people don't have to be this hypersensitive about stuff if they don't choose to. For example, it's very normal to say, "Well, look, this is on the BBC. I personally didn't like it. In fact, I found it a little bit offensive. Anyway, what's for dinner? That is a healthy attitude, right? You don't have to have a meltdown every time you find something offensive. I find stuff offensive every day, and I just get on with my life. Do you know what I mean? So I also think part of this is just a general rise in hypersensitivity and a feeling that being offended by something it entitles you to things. Like Steve Hughes, the brilliant Australian comic, he had a whole routine, which ironically he did on Live at the Apollo about 10 years ago, about, so what if you're offended? Nothing happens. Be offended. That's okay. And to me, that is what we've moved away from. I've got no problem with someone going on Live at the Apollo and doing a whole set that I not only don't like, but also disagree with and find offensive. As long as I mentioned earlier, there's balance. As long as when someone I do like goes on Live at the Apollo and says things that offend other people, they have that same attitude of tolerance, right? We keep being told that tolerance is the most sacred value of Western civilization. Great. Well, let's practice some of it, Neil.
I completely agree. My girlfriend went to a comedy gig, a very prestigious and very reputable comedy club. And when she came back, I asked her, how was it? And she went, you know, the thing is, Francis, it was all very dull.
It's because I wasn't there.
And this is somebody who is actually, you know, very left-wing when it comes to her political opinions. And you know, is a woman of I hate this crap, but you know, this is not someone who you would think is, you know, your traditional person who would be like, oh, this is, you know, this is boring, whatever else. And she was like, no, it was boring. No one said anything interesting. No one said anything that actually challenged me or made me think. It was just people, you know, churning out very, very bland comedy. And she was blaming the comedians. I said to her, hang on, look a second. You can't blame the comedians, because they are operating in a system that encourages that type of material. They're playing a lot of the times, particularly in London, to audiences that want that type of material. How are you going to produce comedy that is challenging, that really pushes back on people, that challenges preconceived notions, if you are not going to get booked for gigs for it? You're going to get pushback. Promoters are going to receive complaints. There's a very good friend of ours who did a material, and he was taking the mick out of BLM, because he was saying, you know, people talk about Black Lives Matter, but no one talks about ugly lives mattering. And actually, this has been proven, discrimination against people who are unattractive is rife. You are far more likely to be successful in your career, successful in your romance, have more friends if you're attractive.
That explains the success of trigonometry, by the way.
Exactly. No. Yeah, and then he made a joke, but nobody's pulling down statues of good-looking people, are they? Now, he did that routine, and this is a routine that wasn't offensive in its...
It's got nothing to do with anything. It's just the BLM is just a prop for the joke.
Yeah,
it's nothing to do with discriminating against anyone, right?
Yeah, exactly. But he did that at a comedy club. He said it went very well. In fact, my partner watched that bit and said it was brilliant, and said it was really, really funny, really interesting. And she's someone who supports BLM. And then when he did it at one club, someone complained about it. They complained about it. It was a white person, of course it was. They complained about it. And as a result, he can't get booked at those series of clubs anymore.
And I'll give you another example, very much in the same vein. You mentioned Top Secret, Neil, which is our favourite club here in the UK. It's absolutely brilliant. And anyone who's watching this, if you're ever in London, make sure you go there, because it's great. When I did comedy, I always had a satirical bent to my comedy. I always talked about politics. I always tried to balance it up in that way. I talked about other stuff too, but politically, I was always someone who was interested in that kind of comedy. And I remember one time coming off stage, it was one of those rare times when I did well, and another comedian came up to me afterwards, and he went, "Wow, man, I can't believe you're doing politics on stage. That I'm so jealous." And I went, "Well, why don't you do it?" And he went, "Oh, no. I mean, at least you're like a Jewish immigrant. Like, I'm a straight white man. There's no, I'm just going to get crushed." That's the climate. That's the climate. People are afraid because they think their identity means that they can't talk about certain things. And I just think that is so incredibly limiting. And frankly, it's just outrageous. I don't want to live in that world.
Yeah, and it's really ruined character comedy as well, because I'm a big fan of Chris Lilly and
No, I
Sacha
love
Baron
Chris
Cohen.
Lilly.
Yeah, but Netflix recently took a few of his shows off their platform. Now they're a private company, so I support the rights of private corporations to do what they want. But I just personally don't like a culture that's led to a major private company taking off satirical programs that people who were in the communities that he was satirizing generally liked. And it's appeasing this very small minority. Now, let me, I guess, play devil's advocate here. A lot of people will respond to certain people who talk about the things we talk about and say, well, times have changed and now there are new voices in comedy and, you know, just because you don't find them funny, this is the future, this is the way young people think and this is how comedy is moving forward. How would you respond to something like that?
Let's fucking see, Neil. Let's see. Let's see what happens. Let's see what numbers they do, and let's see what numbers people like us do. And let's see where they are 5 years from now and where we are 5 years from now. Right? As you said yourself, going on live at the Apollo or the Australian equivalent, that used to make your career. Nowadays, I see people who've done live at the Apollo, they've got like 5,000 Twitter followers. Right? People aren't buying what they're selling. That's so. Francis and I, like you, believe in absolute freedom for everybody. You do the comedy that you want to do.
Apart from the people we disagree with.
Obviously, they should be in the camp. But no, look, the point is, right, they can do whatever comedy they want to do. Francis and I would never call for comedians to not be given an opportunity because of what they talk about or the jokes that they make, unless they're just not very good, right? And even then, let them do their thing. I'm not bitter about it. We'll sell out the Apollo with Trigonometry ourselves. Why would I want to do someone else's show at live at the Apollo? I've got no problem with that. My point is something else, which is, you know, it comes back to that thing about balance. But if your question is, you know, what is my answer to those people? My answer to those people is, let's count the money in the bank 5 years from now and see who's doing better. And I bet you people who are doing real comedy, who are being truthful, who are being authentic, who are unafraid, who are pushing boundaries, who are doing actual jokes that are funny, I bet you, I just have this, you know, random feeling, Neil, that those people are going to do better. You know, and it remains to be seen.
Yeah, and that's completely my view. You know, they say this is what young people want. And in a way, they're right. A certain subsection of people do want that comedy. But the vast majority of people don't. Whenever I talk to people, you know, and it's different people, you know, the plumber comes round to the house to fix the toilet. And they'll go, oh, what do you do, mate? I go, I'm actually a comedian. He goes, do you know what? They will always say this, right? Regardless of who they are or, you know, colour, race, etc. They always go, you know what, I used to love comedy. I used to really enjoy it back in the day, 10, 15 years ago. Now I watch it and I go, oh, it's just not funny, is it? And that's what most people, that's what a lot of people think. That's what most people think. That's what the average person thinks. It's not funny. We've got to the stage, Neil, where people's jokes on WhatsApp are actually funnier than mainstream and TV comedy. And once that happens, comedy's in a dark place.
And the thing as well is that level of kind of intolerance is got to a point where, like Francis says, people don't actually listen to what the joke is anymore. They hear key buzzwords and they switch off. I'll give you an example. I had a routine that I used to do, and I'm not the only comedian who's come up with this, as I later discovered, but it was a routine about how we need a Special Olympics for white people. And it was all talking about how white people are terrible at athletics, right? So it was a routine that was making fun of white people, but because it involved
Need
race,
Indians there too.
yeah, right, exactly. So, but because it was even though by the comedy standards it was punching up at the all-powerful group, the more time went on, the better that bit became, because as you perfect the routine, it gets better. You add little ad libs, etc. The routine got better. The reaction, certainly in certain clubs, got a lot worse over time because people would just hear white Olympic and that was it. They weren't listening anymore. They just weren't listening. And I think that's the problem we've got. And when you get to that stage, yeah, those people are going to want somebody who never makes them think and never offends them. But that's not the majority of the public. That's not the majority of the public. They don't want that. And it's as true of people from minority backgrounds as it is as it does. I mean, give you an example. Here in London, we have what are called urban gigs, and those are gigs in the city where they're predominantly black. And at those gigs, you could always say way more in terms of pushing the edge than you could at any other gig, because they're not feeling guilty. They're not worried about how they look about laughing at a joke, because they're just like, do you know what I mean? And that was always very frustrating. Like Francis says, it's usually guilty middle-class white people that are the ones that are getting upset about stuff.
Yeah, and the ones who are looking over the shoulder and seeing if they have permission to laugh. It's, you know, it's a very, psychologically, it's a very interesting phenomenon. It's a very, very interesting phenomenon where we are. I just hope that the more we can get out and voices like ours and yours can be heard, the more people realise that comedy is still alive and well. It's just they're being presented with a misrepresentation of the quality in the clubs, in the touring circuit. So here's another example for you, Neil. If you look at one of the most diverse industries in the world, it's the football, soccer, Premier League. You look at, for instance, the Liverpool Football Club, who are probably the best team in the league at the moment. Their front three, there's a Brazilian and there's two African Muslim guys, Sadio Mane and Mohamed Salah, right? And I'm absolutely certain that Liverpool didn't go, do you know what, looking around at the team, we need more Muslim fellas in here. Do you know what? We need to get the whole diversity going, guys. Otherwise, we can't be true. Otherwise, we don't have real equity. No, what they did was they had a system which was as meritocratic as it possibly could be. And do you know what? If you have absolute meritocracy and what you have are the best people rising to the top, you are going to get diversity because then you're just going to be promoting people because of their ability. So you're going to get people. You know, people don't need, you know, this type of patronising outlook from middle-class liberals who are like, oh, I'm going to do this person a favour. Nobody needs that. It's patronising.
Yeah. Look, for balance, we should say that historically, obviously, there was a period of time when certain groups were being discriminated against in comedy. And so what we absolutely are saying is discrimination is wrong and it should be eliminated completely. Nobody should be treated differently because of who they are, their identity, their background, etc. But that applies both directions, right? People should just be treated as individual human beings and judged on the merits of their work. That's it. It's as simple as that. It doesn't have to even be very complicated. If you're good, you progress. If you're not, you don't. And it doesn't matter if you're a lesbian who would have been discriminated against even probably as recently as 15 years ago in this country, right? Or an ethnic minority who, again, at some point you would have been discriminated against. Right, it doesn't matter if you're that or you are one of these evil straight white men. Just stop discriminating and just treat people based on who they are. To me, that's a pretty reasonable message, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I also find it so disheartening when you see these comedians who've been handpicked and their whole ethos is that they see themselves as this perpetual victim who can't do anything and has no agency over their lives. And I don't find that empowering. I would guess most of the people of colour in my audience don't find that empowering. So who are these people who are deciding what's empowering and what's a good message for young people to see? I can't help but feel it's richer, older, white liberals, as you say. I mean, in Australia, liberal is actually our conservative government, so it's all down under here. But there's nothing empowering about this. I actually distinctly remember there was an Indigenous Australian comedian who was telling me about how he was working in the ABC, again the equivalent of your BBC, and how he was against there being a welcome to country at the start of a comedy show. So what our Melbourne Comedy Festival did one year was say that before every comedy show we have to say that this is and always will be traditional Aboriginal land, and it just sullied the mood completely. I mean, I don't see how that's relevant before a comedy show. You could feel, it was palpable from backstage, you could feel the audience become deflated, just being reminded about a genocide. You know, that's the right thing to say before someone gets on stage and tries to laugh. Before
the comedy, let's remember all the people who've been brutally murdered. Great.
Yeah. Yeah, who thought of that?
And here's your first act.
Exactly, right? Yeah. I mean, that's a good challenge for the comedian. Like, try and make them laugh after that. Then you're a good comedian. And so he was actually arguing with a white person about why that was dumb. And he's Indigenous. So it's just all very bizarre, isn't it? To conclude this one, what do you hope to achieve with Trigonometry? Where would you love to see comedy, but also Trigonometry and yourselves in 5 and then maybe even 10 years? What's the goal?
Well, we want to be the Joe Rogan of Europe. That's what we want. We want to be hosting really authentic conversations with really interesting people and talking openly and honestly about all the difficult stuff that we shy away from talking about in society, because we believe that's how you heal divides. That's how you bring people together. That example I gave you earlier about a right-leaning guy and 2 left-wingers living in the same flat, watching the show and coming closer together. That's what we want to be doing. We are in such a terrible place politically and culturally, where people hate each other, where people see each other as enemies. And what we are trying to do is show the humanity of both sides to each other and try to bring them a little bit closer together, bring them out of that polarization. And, you know, I think Joe does that very well. He's different to us. We have a different style. We have a different approach. But really, we want to be the #1 place for those healthy conversations to be going on here in Europe.
Yeah, that's exactly what we want to do. We also want to put our own... We also want to have our own TV show. That would be incredible. Topical TV show, which is actually fair, which is actually balanced, where we talk, where we make fun of everybody. Let's bring people back to the centre. That's what we want to do. And hopefully, there is more than enough people out there just waiting for us to give them what they want. So that's what we want, really.
And look, by the way, if Francis' depressive pessimism is accurate and it never happens on TV, great, we'll do it ourselves. That's the beauty of the internet. We are going to make everything happen ourselves. And in some ways, it'll probably be even better for it because there will be less restriction around what we can do. So either way, it's going to happen, man. And you know, we feel incredibly positive despite Francis' innate pessimism about the future, because the facts are the facts, man. The fundamentals is like with the economics. The fundamentals are the fundamentals. And the fundamentals are is people like good comedy and they don't like shit comedy. And if we make good stuff, people will watch it. Simple as that.
Love that. Well, if you guys are watching this interview and you haven't heard of Trigonometry, you've been living under a rock, go check them out, go subscribe. All the links are in the description. Next time you're in Australia, in the prison colony, let me know. And yeah, I'll come check you guys out when I'm in the UK.
Look forward to it, man. We should get you on the show when you're here. Come on over.
I'd love to. Next time I'm in the UK, I'll definitely let you know. Enjoy your weekend. Hopefully you can get through the UK winter okay, and I'll talk to you guys soon.
Right, take care, Neil.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Take
man.
care, mate.